What are evidence-based interventions, or EBIs? EBIs are treatments to improve student academic and behavioral difficulties. They are designed for use with specific groups of students who have specific difficulties. They're validated for use based on the results of group-based and single-subject-based outcome studies. They must be implemented with integrity, or they must be used as they were designed to be implemented. EBIs are treatments or instructional approaches designed to mollify difficulties experienced by students. These difficulties can be academically or behaviorally based. Often students will experience concomitant difficulties in these areas. Thus, a single evidence-based intervention may improve functioning in both areas, or educational personnel will have to use multiple EBIs in conjunction with one another. Intervention selection is often guided by purported wisdom or is decided based on instructor emotion. This should never be the case. Instead, intervention selection must be based on evidence derived from outcome studies. There are two basic types of outcome studies. The first are group studies. Generally, in group studies, one group receives an intervention and one group does not receive the intervention. This comparison allows researchers to assume that any difference between the two groups' performance is due to the intervention. The second type of outcome studies are single-subject studies. The logic is similar, but instead of group comparisons, a person's performance before the implementation of the intervention is compared to her or his performance after receiving the intervention. Any difference is thought to be the result of the intervention. An intervention's designation as being evidence-based is contingent on at least three factors. The first is the strength of the design. For group studies, this involves the use of large, representative samples. It also requires the use of a control group and an intervention group, with random assignment determining what group participants are placed in. For single subject studies, this involves the number of measurements of the skill of interest. It also depends on the number of times the intervention is shown to impact a student's performance on the skill of interest. The second consideration is the size of the effect of the intervention. For group studies, this is often reported as Cohen's d. Cohen's d represents the average amount of difference between control and intervention groups' separate performances. For instance, a Cohen's d of 1 means that the intervention group's performance, on average, was 1 standard deviation higher than the control group. The larger the value of Cohen's d, the greater the impact of the intervention. For single subject studies, the size of effect is the amount of difference between a person's scores taken before and after the implementation of the intervention. Percent of non-overlapping data, or P&D, is often reported as a pseudo effect size. Bear in mind, though, that P&D and Cohen's d are not equivalent. Cohen's d indicates the magnitude of the difference between groups due to the intervention, while P&D indicates that the intervention led to consistently higher scores. Cohen's d is a measure of size, while P&D is a measure of consistency. The last consideration is the mandate of replication. All results of any outcome study must be considered in the context of the entire research base and not interpreted in isolation. This is important in that one study pointing to an intervention being ineffective should not be taken as law if the vast majority of previous studies have indicated differently. In group studies, this involves evaluating an intervention's effectiveness with multiple and varied samples. In single subject studies, this involves repeatedly implementing and withdrawing an intervention to show its impact on student behavior. Finally, for any evidence-based intervention to be effective, it must be implemented as it was meant to be implemented, or it must be used with integrity. This involves using the appropriate materials to execute the core components of the intervention for the predetermined amount of time. In summary, evidence-based interventions are treatments for academic and behavioral difficulties. They are used for specific groups of students exhibiting specific academic or behavioral difficulties. Their designation as being evidence-based is derived from the results of group-based and single-subject outcome studies. Finally, for any evidence-based intervention to be effective, it must be implemented with integrity.